First of all, it's a great sharaf. It's an honor for me. I'm not giving of my time. You are making my time have value and worth. And wallahi, I mean that. This is an important opportunity. And my topic also integrates with the thinking going on in the mosque. And so it would be my honor to carry on a conversation with the imam or the imams on solidarity in its various spheres that I'll be speaking about. One is, for instance, that there has to be a solidarity and the unity in oneself, basically in one's faculties. In other words, the human being is composed of different parts, and they might all initially want to go in different directions, right? So we have to establish a leadership and a purification and a unification and a solidarity inside of ourselves. The traditional ulama, they have a very specific way of speaking about that unity. And after this, one becomes capable of naturally leading people outside of oneself. So in other words, one has to get one's own ethical house in order, and then the social can be solved. Now, the social has various rings that we'll be speaking about. And the first ring typically is the home. So Imam al-Ghazali will treat the topic of an-nikah and marriage. Why? Because that's the next unit in which we live our lives. And we affect it and it affects us. That's something I'll be talking about, is the idea of what is a culture and how does it shape us, but how can we try to be proactive and shape it, especially because the time that we live in, as I'll be arguing, is an anti-culture, effectively. So the role of a culture is supposed to be a repository of wisdom, expectations, rules, so that people have a shared understanding of what it is that we're supposed to do, how we interact with each other. And that affects all of our social relations. When we don't share the expectations that other people have, or we don't inspire trust in them, then social bonds break, right? And that can affect us in terms of our friendships, okay? All of these topics, there are important points lying under them, so I'm just saying that beyond the home, then, the friendship, the mosque, this is a communal bond. When we walk into the mosque, we don't realize it and think about it, but we all have expectations from each other. We all will come away, just to use the modern terminology, with a good experience or a bad experience, not to shift everything into a materialist, capitalist paradigm. But we need to start to see that our language, and therefore our thought, I'm not advocating NLP here, neuro-linguistic programming, but our language is a mirror that shows us how we think. So we need to start thinking about our language, because that's going to show us what we think of culture, which informs the bonds by which we either do or do not have solidarity, whether we do or do not have a prophetic spirit. And I'll just say finally that before beginning a bit more formally here, that indeed, as I mentioned, it's one of the teachers who has I believe, a divine permission, but a permission outwardly, which is an important thing in our deen, advocated this topic. So this topic is not my own bread and butter, my cup of tea, where I'm comfortable, but it does link to my thesis, and I'll be reading for about well, let's say the most substantial chunk will be on tazkiyah from a pre-written document, which I think is hopefully it's an amazing insight into the nature of Islam and ihsan and iman, which spells out the Prophet's teaching of tazkiyah. Okay, so how does that all link together? Without getting ahead of myself here, in a nutshell, when we are engaging outside of ourselves with others in a social setting with various rings, as I mentioned, they're all rings, they all have their own adab and their own realities, and they need to be understood and known, especially if we are going to have, someone has to have a leadership position in every matter. Every matter has to have an emir. Okay? Now that means that if we're living in a culture which basically tells us, leave everything to the government, leave everything to the corporation, forget your local knowledge. Families are, too much trouble, drop your children to the school. This encouragement to specialize disempowers us. And then these bonds that I'm speaking about break down. And these bonds are an opportunity for the prophetic spirit to flow through us. They are needed. They are fard kifayas. They're wajib. They're communal obligations that we cannot sit back and watch crumble. Someone has to step up and collectively come together and say, we need to understand the institution of marriage. We need to understand the institution of society. We need to, even political thought. What we have right now is not a genuine either religious or philosophical political thought. What we have is ideas that we pick up from the ambient liberalism, which is either slightly conservative or slightly liberal, but they all fall under liberal with a capital L. Okay, and that needs to be understood, that if we don't take the initiative to educate ourselves and to read Imam al-Ghazali and also to think collectively about these topics, we are in what I'll say inside the paper, which is a good indication to begin, we're in an ideological ooze. It's a sludge of which has emerged, and I'll explain how it has emerged. Okay, so Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma inna nas'aluka al-birra wa taqwa wa min al-amali ma tarda. Allahumma a'inna ala ma aqamtana fihi. وأرنا حقائق الإيمان عيانا وعلمنا ما يرشدنا إلى الإحسان آمين آمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. It's my aim to convey a comprehensive and holistic manner of looking at the words in the title of today's topic, which is solidarity, servitude, and the soul, and how they're related. And it's my belief that understanding solidarity and how to bring it about requires awareness of the time that we live in. We say, al-faqih, faqihu zamanihi. Someone who is a faqih, who understands the deen, has to understand the time that they live in. Otherwise, they're arguably not a faqih. And to bring it about requires awareness of the time that we live in. And the very thick ideology by which we generally are educated to think. Okay, things like the best form of governance is democracy, and anything else is sort of treacherous, to even consider. That's not real intellectual freedom about how to think about communities, etc. That's sort of a non-negotiable. So I want to start to point this out, how we're in, I don't want to invoke popular films and things, but a sort of a matrix. Anyway, so it's my argument or thesis that we inhabit a historically unique culture, both in the contemporary West and in contemporary Islam. Without understanding this, I believe efforts to achieve solidarity will break down. So you might actually try and bring about solidarity through your akhlaq, in your family, at the mosque, and you see things don't work. And this is what's crucial, is for us to empower ourselves to win these battles and to be effective, basically. So without understanding this, I believe efforts to achieve solidarity will break down, and not merely due to individualism, as though it were a distinct force. Finally, it is clear that one engaging with what we may broadly call social spheres will encounter firsthand the vexing reality of a lack of unity, and that if one addresses this awareness, taking initiative to solve problems and deploying wisdom, that engagement itself affords the perfect opportunity not only for opposing the lower self, but for achieving spiritual excellence, ihsan, through one's attempts to solidarity. So I will keep holding my bar here. Someone else that I'm working with can have a low bar, but I'm not going to stoop to their level. This is difficult. This goes against human nature. This requires us to have a niyyah, to have ikhlas, in order to hold our bar higher and have the ihsan. So solidarity, I argue, is a realization of our unity in various spheres. Okay, and those spheres need to be brought clearly before our mind, and that's part of what we'll attempt to do today. So we may think of this visually, if we like. So we can think of solidarity and unity in the middle of a circle as the meaning around which we will be speaking today. And outside of the sphere, we have a unity which is not just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over His creation, that there is an overall unity, that He is the ruler and the wise creator and the guide who sets up an entire creation from the top to the bottom, His command descending through the heavens, through the angels, and into the seven heavens, etc., and down to your cereal for suhoor, or your chapatis, or whatever it is. None of that happens outside of this cosmological unity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in place. So that same cosmology manifests then in the individual person. We, in a traditional way of looking at ethics, have this same command center, as it were, this tap into the realities and intelligibility, which is the human intellect, which is a great gift. And from this, our will, our volition, our feelings, our akhlaq come down. And from this, our actions emanate. So there is a microcosm inside of us. The same thing happens in the household. In the household, you have parts. You have hands, eyes, feet, a mind, and it is supposed to come together as a unity. The same happens then outside of the household in the political realm, whatever that is, which is good to speak about. And I'm happy to take questions either during the presentation or at the end. So this is what our classical tradition teaches us, and what our traditional ulama have believed, and it is also how they build the map of the Islamic sciences geared towards achieving it. Okay, so this is something that after returning from studies overseas, that I effectively realized that in our societies, there are certain things that children, for instance, can be taught, or that can be taught at the mosque, which feed into a modern or modernist religion. So I'll just give you an example of that. If everything that I'm learning does not connect with and perhaps even offer an alternative to what goes on outside of the mosque or outside of my home, then I'm basically accepting a secularized form of religion. Okay, so there are certain things that we can be taught about how the Islamic sciences have something to say about everything. You know, we all say that the Prophet ﷺ taught the most of mundane things because he taught everything. He taught all good. Okay, if we allow our presentation of the sciences not to link with what's going on, if we don't have a thorough vision and classification of the sciences, even our ulama spoke about natural science, and what they say about it has continuing relevance and even eternal insight. If we don't have that full vision, then the unity will break down at that level, which is the political and communal. So they have spoken about this wider unity, and to realize these three unities, one needs purification. So the home and society not only needs it, but is achieved by aiming for it. In other words, putting the nafs aside in order to solve problems, to be focused on bringing about that unity and taking responsibility for it, as opposed to listening to the waswas of my nafs and saying, I'll mention one story as well before sort of slightly going into lecture mode here. So I was at the Wembley Arena sometime after the unfortunate and ridiculous 7/7 incident, and Habib Ali Jeffrey was speaking on the microphone, and for maybe the last 20-30 minutes before he began speaking, the fellow that was next to me had his arm completely on the armrest, and I was tired in the seat, so my arm was sort of like this, and I thought maybe I should be a little bit more just polite and assertive and just put my elbow at least to the half point. And so Habib Ali began speaking about the ma'ani that are in the meanings, the deep spiritual meanings that are embodied in the Prophet ﷺ, in his character, that you can see expressed not in a book but in his actual character ﷺ. And at one point he said, but look at us, many of us are sitting here feeling uptight because our neighbor has their elbow past the halfway spot on the armrest. So wallahi, this is a true story. So this is where we are. So we have to acknowledge this as our starting point, but aim for the very highest level of suppression of the nafs and solidarity. And as I'll say, this is what culture is supposed to do. That's coming later, so let me get to it. So the home and society require engaging with the wider culture through what I said was the fard kifaya, and even with the notion of classification of the sciences. If one achieves this solidarity in each field, one is able to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the source and beginning. In other words, rather than complain that, my gosh, you know, the culture out there, the social interactions, they're not inspiring me, they're tiring me. Yes, we have to invest in them. Yes, we have to convey expectations to people. Yes, we have to take responsibility for teaching each other. If modernity causes new problems that aren't in our books, then someone needs to take responsibility for getting heads together, solving these problems, and teaching it, rather than just sitting back and being passive atoms in the current. There are people like Noam Chomsky and others that would say that, and we have people from our own tradition saying this, that modernity intentionally atomizes us such that it can then harvest our economic potentialities without resistance, without your own notion of What do you want to do with your life? What is your good? What is your community? So they can be compatible. We can take the higher ethical stance and say, no, I'm going to have my vision and I'm going to tell you how this can all work together positively, and it can. This one now. So normally a pre-modern culture shapes one and facilitates transcendence of the self. What could be more important? Imagine walking out your door and you live in a culture that is made to make you transcend yourself. Okay, but as argued by Philip Reef and others, modern culture has undergone a fundamental transformation. As such, spiritual excellence is now required so that we may invest into culture, and at the same time, spiritual excellence is facilitated potentially by opposing the ego in perseverance and some engagement, which hopefully transcends the typical forms of social engagement produced by modernity, such as social media. That is an example of us being passive and accepting their forms of social engagement. Perhaps that form of social engagement is not going to bring about the transformation that's needed. So, Bismillah. So, step by step, then, in the topic or the subtopics, we'll first name the forms of solidarity with reference to quarter 2 of Ihya Ulumuddin, which is on mu'amala and ma'ayasha, interacting with people, working with people. So this treats right living and social dealings with others, the modes of which both liberal capitalism and communism or Marxism have eaten away at. So the real capital that we have, which is our culture, which you notice, if you fly into a country like Morocco, or you fly into a country like Turkey or other places, you sense that this place has a very different culture that facilitates certain things. It makes them easy, it makes them natural. Okay, well, we have to work with the culture that we're given, but invest into it. And that is what Islam has always done historically. So those two forces, so they are both anti-traditional in a way, capitalism and communism, or liberalism as well. They have forced what we call the intermediate between the individual and the political to be lost and discarded. So what is there between the individual and the political? They're all forms of, what they would say is we've lost the role of the church, right? Well, we're now fitting into their model as we've inherited it, whether we think about that or not, okay? But all forms of clubs, all forms of social interaction, schools, the mosque, of course, these are, it behooves one to sit down and write out what are my social engagements and name them and identify them and start to think about the quality that they have and whether there's a solidarity there or not. And name that culture. What is it? What do you call this type of behavior? There's a fantastic book called Watching the English, which I'd highly recommend if anyone wants to understand this little and ancient island that we are living in. So this intermediate is, for instance, the family, the church, and other forms of society which carry cultural capital that are perceived as impeding the aims of capitalism and communism. Further, when the state is involved in everything, it not only commodifies it, but it renders it into ideology, which in a word means that it speaks about morality, it speaks about social connections, it speaks about economy, but it's not encouraging you to really learn the topic and think for yourself. It's trying to galvanize you to feed into a party system, for instance, in which the choices are already limited and not giving you the opportunity to think from what we would technically call first principles, right? So when we go back and read the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, Imam al-Ghazali, for instance, for each topic that he will treat, he talks about the haqiqah and the fadila, and then he will talk about how to correct this topic. So we have to first say, what is the reality of marriage? What is the reality of friendship? What is the reality of patience? What is the reality of dhikr, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And only after we clearly have the reality and concept firm in our minds can we even begin to speak about the topic. And you will find that if you look in the topics of the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, they are not what we in a sort of secular age refer to as religion. They go into everything. And you will find yourself informed with this. But if you don't share that vision with those that you're encountering, you'll find yourself on a different page from them. So this is all a matter of us taking responsibility for our other brothers and sisters and our ummah to convey, to even give them the chance to start to think correctly about topics beyond just salat and saum. And as we know, salat and saum are supposed to have a social impact. So they're already things of that kind. So we must then take stock. So it would be very easy in a presentation like this for me to simply say, here are the adab of solidarity, and here are the forms of solidarity that are mentioned, for instance, in book quarter 2 of the Ihya. Preference of others over oneself, taking care of others, respecting others, and these adab are mentioned in the traditional manuals. Doubtless, it's well worth looking through the full second quarter of the Ihya, but there are tricks, big tricks to applying it. Thus, we need to study our culture and what is justifiably termed an anti-culture. So, a little micro account of that. Sigmund Freud, who was had a greater impact than we might realize, assessed at his moment in European history that the culture that was there no longer deserved the trust to perform the role of a traditional culture, which is to serve as a collective body and set of values that one realigns with in order to overcome one's own individual difficulties, to reach a transformation and a salvation, etc. So this role is ideally something for us like an initiatic rite of passage by which one becomes an adult and engaged in that society. So Freud assessed modern culture, finding that he could not advise his patients to do what traditional cultures have always done. We might disagree with Freud's own psychology, and we do, but we hold that the context of post-World War II culture, in that context, he's right. And we need to start to understand the culture in which we inhabit. So after this assessment, we return to a discussion of how purification of the individual comes about in Islam. We might think of this as the engine of purification. So, solidarity and purification, well, what is the general way that the soul is purified? So we'll speak about Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, and their vision of how the soul is purified. And this lies behind our discussion of how working towards solidarity might lead to purification. So we have that model in mind. Now, having solidarity in oneself, one's home, and with friends, and perhaps in wider circles such as one's town, county, and country, there are various forms of social interaction in which solidarity requires looking out for the common good. So we'll see that for Al-Ghazali, solidarity is brought about when vice and its actions which harm and vex others are suppressed and replaced with virtues. So good character traits, right? But Ghazali has a whole way of looking at virtue and good character. I mean, when we say good character, this can become a very flat secular notion. So we need to think about what it is that brings about the solidarity. So this naturally brings about love and oneness of hearts between people. Okay, so this is a oneness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took care of at the beginning of our revelation, right? In Ali Imran, where it's said that the Arabs at that time were ala shafa hufratan min an-nar. They were almost about to fall into a great pit, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and brought the religion of Islam and repaired and made a rapprochement between their hearts. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that even if you were to spend mountains of gold to bring the hearts together in the way that we did, you would never be able to do it. Okay, so this was a gift that's given to us, and it's a wajib on us to protect it. If we have lost some of it, then we need to reinvest in this social solidarity and think about how it is that we can go forward. So we will conclude with a knowledge-based vision of what is needed for a communal solidarity. I might leave that sort of for a Q&A just to kind of get through the material here. And is not treated merely with traits of heart and the character. In other words, character traits will not explain how to bring about the fard kifaya, the communal obligations and the unity that's there beyond oneself. And even in the home, there are so many knowledge-based issues that come up, even in one's conception of one's relationships, including the marital relationship. One has to have a conception of what is this, and then in families as well. And that some of these are spoken about, but what's happened is that the authority of some figure who the buck stops with them has effectively been lost in many cases. So many of us have moved from one country to another. So sociologically they speak about what we're all going through, that we've been uprooted, and then when we're in a new context, we might be a bit shy, hesitant, unempowered, and at the end of the day, if we don't understand these topics, we'll end up dropping the ball. We'll end up not taking responsibility, okay? So I'll just give one example here from my own experience in Egypt, which is that my Mubarak father-in-law, rahimahullah, was, sometimes they speak of almost like a sheikh of the family, that in a group of families, there's someone who, when people fall out with each other and that unity and solidarity breaks, they trust that this person has the absolutely necessary role of real leadership, which is wanting your good for you, not seeking their own good. This is something sort of lacking in modernity, that we are encouraged to be individualistic, and the leaders are also individualistic. Okay, and so what ends up getting served in this big bureaucratic system, which starts to take care of our lives and pay us checks when we're out of work and make us rely on it, the NHS, all of these systems which come into our lives and start to fulfill our needs, they are technocratic, and they encourage us to lose our local knowledge and not to take responsibility for these rings of the social and to drop the ball. So someone needs to be there who at the end of the day has that authority to bring the hearts back together. And we have to reform those in a new context, which means thinking about it, which means taking responsibility for it. And the way that we work now as well, with a corporate structure and using PR paradigms for our thinking, it's a different spirit. It's not the traditional thought nor the traditional spirit of the Deen and the Prophet ﷺ. And it will start to make us interact with people in a way which harms them and hurts them at some level if we don't come back and renew these things. Okay, so there's a tazkiyah element in that need for someone to step up and take these roles and have this solidarity. And we all experience it ourselves if we work with an organization, etc. So it requires self-sacrifice for us as parents, etc., or husbands and wives to pursue these obligations. And in the post-industrial liberal society, we inherit seeking knowledge which is not directly related to serving this technocracy and the corporations and developing our CV. And I'd include in that technocracy medicine and pharmacy and even the university. It has to come at the expense of your own pocketbook. It has to come at the expense of your own social prestige. Right? If we accept this paradigm that our role here is simply to pursue social prestige, we won't take care of these matters. So I'll lay out some broad categories of communal obligations and knowledge without which we can never sort out a culture for ourselves which is worthy of integration. So I'll also share my personal sentiment that learning political philosophy is liberating. I believe it is obvious that in spite of everything being politicized these days, that political thought is a mere ideological and sentimental ooze. It's not real thought, and it's not a real religious spirit. That it's also full of emotional polarization, and it's anything but empowering. It doesn't really empower you to do anything other than to engage in a party system, which doesn't really answer the questions that you have are not even on the agenda, and they can't be on the agenda. You cannot even speak about family values in either right or left politics these days. So learning to think rationally empowers the individuals, and Imam al-Ghazali is no slouch when it comes to rational thought. And in our context of specialization, and also it's indirect, but it is Marxist in origin, our distrust of authority has rotted our ability to solve our own problems. Okay, so I'll quickly mention the rings of, you might think of Stephen Covey's rings of influence, something like that, but there are rings of social interaction where solidarity is required. And the substantial topics then would be to explain what is culture and why is it justified? Why could I step over into the university and claim that this culture is an anti-culture and be able to defend that thesis in front of historians? It is true. It's just, and it's almost impossible to remember this without muraqabah, because it's like the water that we are in as fish. It's like the air that we are in. When we breathe, when we think, when we turn on the TV set, whatever it is, we're being reminded of something which becomes invisible to us. So it's very crucial to be reflective. And I'll speak about ihsan, and I think the Fard Kifaya vision, if it comes up in Q&A, fine. So to start with the little micro topic here, first, types of solidarity. So it is already a cliche or trope that our society is characterized by individualism. When we speak of culture in what follows, we'll mention that institutions such as the family have been eroded in a way that no longer matches even the basal state presumed in manuals such as the Ihya. The Ihya presumes that you are somewhere before it begins to speak to you. Nonetheless, the point for reinvigorating the social relations that compose our mu'amala outside of our individual selves is the second quarter of the ihya. How do we confront this erosion that's taken place for the family? Why are we encouraged not to have children? Why are we encouraged in a country that has a fair amount of, very arguably, all of these things are arguable, but when you reach a certain economic and social status, there are certain characteristics that start to inflict you, right? Education becomes more expensive, so you want to have less children. It encourages both parents to go outside of the home, to drop children off in nursery and get involved in the whole bureaucratized life in which you are not in control of your relationships, and the house becomes a sort of pod that you charge up in at night and fire out of in the morning. Whereas the house used to be a place of production. Tadbir al-manzil is translated into English as home economics. What do they teach in home economics? How to cook, how to sew, and how to plant things and have agriculture and grow things. What do you do if there's an embargo or there's a war and you're in a city with hundreds of thousands or millions of people and there's nothing to eat? So we don't have tawakkul ala Allah in this system. We have tawakkul on this system. And it not only puts you to sleep, but it absorbs all of your extra energy. After children have gone to school for 8 hours, you want to sit down and teach them the deen. It's very challenging. Okay, so it also includes the ihya includes a crucial book setting out financial dealings, and I believe that there's a need to renew this book not only through Islamic literature on the topic, but also through observing ethical responses to modern financial principles and interactions, because these things affect us. But noting the types of solidarity found in the second quarter, I want to point out that the basis of solidarity with others is a solidarity and unity inside oneself. So if we're not in control of ourselves, if our parts do not follow the whole meaning that we envision for life, like we're actually being treacherous to ourselves, we believe in this, but we're doing that. If we are not free from harm of ourselves and harming our own goals, and even harming our own ethical aims and our own spiritual vision by letting ourselves down and dropping our bar, then others cannot trust us and hope for solidarity with us. So the Ghazali tells us that authority and governorship with others begin with the same inside of ourselves first. So once our faculties are obedient to us and to the intellect and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, others will naturally accept our leadership. This is part of why the microcosm and macrocosm analogy is emphasized by Al-Ghazali and Ar-Raghib al-Isfahani. So there was this notion that the entire universe is a unity, the community is a unity, perhaps the home is a sub-unity, and the individual is a unity of parts. And you can find resemblance, you can find a head in society, you can find a head in the universe, a head in the human being. You can find eyes, and you can literally start to say, okay, this type of job is like this. So Imam al-Ghazali will talk about where is the postal service inside of the human being? Where is the think tank? Where is the muscles? Where are the hands? Where are the sinews? They're all there, right? And that is unity that we need. So they alluded to this, and I also alluded to it at the beginning in that visualization around solidarity, that there is a cosmos or a cosmology which with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the head, and some people would say more than that the entire cosmos is a manifestation of His divine attributes and actions and rulings, and that there is nothing besides His actions and rulings and attributes and essence. But as Ghazali will state, we must put our faculties such as anger and desire, we all have anger and desire, in charge of Allah and the intellect, and that makes a unity. And it produces a formal unity, an internal solidarity, and also a freedom from the harm of our lower self. So let us note from the beginning that the Greek notion of leadership is more subtle than the modern. So the Greek leader is termed an archon, from the word arche, which means principle and starting point of motion. So the leader is like, the leader in the community is like your intellect and mind inside your body. When the leader speaks, it does not merely bark orders that you must follow whether you want to or not, but it persuades through principles and arguments, and the soul and the body then move volitionally. So there are references to this in Al-Ghazali when he talks about al-muta', that there is in the universe and in the human being something which is naturally obeyed, okay? And this is intellect, and there are secrets even to do with the Prophet's cosmological role, that in the universe we always find at least these levels of intellect, soul, and body. But we have to think here that, look at the notion of authority, right? So the Greeks referred to the mode of leadership in Persia and Egypt, by contrast, as despotic. So not merely tyrannical, but as despos. So it's a form of almost ownership where they treated their subjects like slaves almost, as opposed to the Greek model where they would reason with them. This person had to uphold reason to deserve respect, and they also had to be a virtuous political entity of any kind, and these are all virtues that are in the Ihya and that we need to embody. They looked for your good rather than their good, their form of spiritual development. And any of us who are put forward into a leadership role, we have to have the courage to allow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take care of our needs, and we solely focus on the need of the whatever type of constituency or group or whatever it is that we're engaging with, whether it's the family. Without solving this issue of authority, we will secularize, because all of these bonds will break down except for my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it can actually even lead to people at an individual level saying, I identify with these liberal values. I feel strange that, the Quran is ordering, okay, but what does the Quran order us to? And we'll see that it is not this negative form of authority, that we have all been galvanized. Anyone who speaks English and watches the telly and the news and speaks to people, you're being galvanized intrinsically to distrust all forms of authority, to break down all hierarchies. And if we don't know how to break out of that paradigm, we'll fall into it. One of the Haddad scholars and Ba'alawis speaks about the stage that we are in after the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate as the Ghuthaiya stage, or so we're either in the stage that the Prophet described of the scum being carried along by a flood, or people who are deep into the lizard hole. So we've followed the Christians and Jews into a lizard hole. And why can we not easily avoid that, because the modern state and economic and political system is more expansive than the traditional. Okay, so someone like Wael Halaq will set these points straight, that it's not Islam which is authoritative, and Islam which is commanding, and Islam which is favoring one sex over another, etc. Islam allowed people to function in the privacy of their home as they wished and willed, and it guided them and gave them counsel. Islam does not, like communism, come and take the wealth of the wealthy away and distribute it. No, it encourages the wealthy to understand what's in their best interest. Okay, it's the modern state which has consignment in its army. It can legally force you to enter into the army and fight. This is not a Sharia thing. It has prisons which are not allowable in Islam. It has a whole set of systems which the Sharia would never allow you to take those rights away from people. So, we need to think for ourselves in all these crucial topics, because it will inform our vision of how to proceed. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, solidarity and its different forms. Bismillah. This is rather brief, and then we'll go into the contemporary anti-culture, and from there, I think the point I'd like to stop on is the engine and mechanism, forgive me for using those words, for tazkiyah and purification of the heart, and then link them. How is it that the solidarity in this strange and difficult context can bring about tazkiyah? So there's a technical treatment of the meaning and ontology and solidarity, which largely I won't be going into. So there are two realist notions of a unity that can come about between what looks like two or more individuals, separate physical, material people, right? What are we talking about with this solidarity and unity? So there are two realist notions here. One is what you might term broadly a peripatetic system, where you look out and things are substances, right? So each human being is a substance. They're not an accident. They're walking around. They look separate. So where is this unity? Okay, and the other is more pointing out the instability in the physical world and saying that there is a spiritual unity which is always there, whether we see it or not. We could call this a Platonic way of looking at the world. And not that we are going to wade into philosophy here, that we look at these, but we look at these because there are two valid ways to account of reality. So you will find scholars in any system will drift into one of these two views. And there are accounts of social realities, such as someone not only being a human, but being a judge or head of state, okay? How does one become a judge if at the end of the day they're just a human? Where is their judgeness? How does one become, how do you take on a social role? And what is the reality of that? Why is it that a judge can send someone to be executed, in spite of the fact that if you look at them, all you see is a human being, pretty much just like any other human being? So where does that role come from? Where does this reality come from? So you might say that being a human is objective, which is a highly problematic term, and that being a judge is socially constructed, right? So are our roles just socially constructed? But matters such as the unity that holds a home or society together is, I would prefer to call it, socially constituted, not merely constructed. And this is a big topic which I'm going to really skim over. So Platonists would hold that there is a real unity that transcends the particulars and the individuals. In the university, which is not where we are, this type of ontology that I'm speaking about is disliked. Okay, it's more of a deconstructionist way of looking at things, where you would say that the role like a judge is a construct, and that construct really doesn't have any reality other than in our minds. And those types of views do seep into all of us. But in the self, there are mystical accounts of the unity of soul that occur under purification, and that are explanative and describe the cosmological levels that interact with various human realities. So the unity of the individual is a topic which is developed more. Now, second is so that's the individual. How does the individual transform? How do they take on roles? How do they take on other realities? Second is the family, studied in Ghazali's book on marriage. Then outside the circle of the home is friendship and companionship, where the relationship is sought out and chosen, unlike the family. In the family, we don't seek out companionship with someone. Arguably, though, in marriage we do, but this is something that's often said in the books that treat this topic. So Al-Ghazali sets out that companionship has a reality, and this reality is violated if its prerequisites and rights are not fulfilled. So were we to read this, we would see that it's not merely rules and regulations. In reality, its reality may be captured were someone to correct you and say, I'm not your friend, I'm your brother. Okay, so friendship is in our contemporary context easily falls prey to cattiness and fickleness, whereas Islam calls for a higher level, which is brotherhood. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, by way of reminding us of His favor upon us, and remember Allah's favor unto you, how you were enemies, and He made friendship between your hearts, so that you became brothers by His grace. Okay, so friendship has this, especially in the age of the remote control, and in what we're going to say is the age of the psychological self, where I just don't feel the way I feel anymore about Ahmed or Zainab or whatever, and so they drop from one's heart. This really expresses an immaturity which is not compatible with Islam. Okay, the higher spirit that the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran guide us to is a paradigm of brotherhood. Anything that you would do for a brother, you do for a friend. Okay, if they let you down, then you keep the bar high. This is necessary for solidarity. Okay, so a friend lets you down, he's hot and cold, he turns his back on you, whatever. When he's ready to come back to you, your door is open, because you operate on the paradigm of brotherhood, not this fickle, catty notion of friendship. Now, Imam al-Ghazali, when he opens the book on ukhuwa and suhbah in quarter 2 of the Ihya and the social relation, he says, know that ulfa, okay, which is friendship or intimacy that one finds in the heart, is the product of husn al-khuluq and good character, and tafarruq, the breakdown of all relationships it's the thamara of bad khuluq. Okay, so tafarruq, he goes on to say, this breakdown and dissolving of the solidarity and people turning their backs on each other and walking away is the product of bad character. Elsewhere he'll say that good character is virtue. Okay, so when he uses this very mundane term of good character and bad character, there's an allusion to the tazkiyah of the individual. So we could briefly recount Al-Ghazali's notion of amal, which is that, and in a way, this topic in the next 2 minutes will relate to the topic of tazkiyah that's going to come. And we need to have an imagination of how tazkiyah occurs in the human soul in order to encourage it to happen and to try and seek it, right? It's just like if we want to plant something in the back garden, we have to have a notion of soil and plants and fertilizers and everything. If we do that, we're much more likely to succeed than if we just rush through the supermarket, buy a pack of seeds and throw it on the soil in our backyard. So we can't afford to treat ourselves in that way without knowledge. So I'll be speaking about the tazkiyah that we want to occur through social solidarity and that we can actually achieve through social solidarity. How is it that by me holding the bar higher and having a vision of a unity in a given sphere can purify myself? So for Ghazali, the idea of amal, now this topic is really treated in the Mizan al-Amal of Imam al-Ghazali. But most of what is there carries over into the Ihya and becomes mu'amala. So amal is really not only ethics, but the heart of ethics, which is the transformation of the human being. Okay, I don't need to remind everyone of the fact that this is the most important thing that we could possibly do in the few days that we have left on this earth, which is to purify the self. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran swears by, I believe it's 7 different items before he says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. So the one who purifies the self is the one who succeeds. Now it's already entailed that the one who doesn't do this does not succeed, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it clear to us. And the one who sullies and dirties and does not purify the self is the one who loses. So this is really what it's all about. So Imam al-Ghazali theoretizes this thing so that we can do it. So he's empowering us. So amal is, and how does it relate to good character and bad character? Bad character is an extreme. Good character is the mean. It's the middle with regards to whatever the topic is. So if it is to do with anger, if you will always find that there is a deficient aspect and an excess with regard to that. So someone can be excessively angry, but then they can also be deficiently angry. For instance, they will allow someone to insult their spouse, to harm their children, and they'll lay there sort of placidly and with a defeatist expression and not stand up for the right, which is effectively also a right and a duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not just for the person. Okay, so that's a deficiency. So the way that this is described is that if we think of putting the finger into water, right? So let's take another example of money and financial management, which is effectively what we're doing when we decide whether to withhold or to spend. We can be excessive in either of these two wings, but in each case, this expresses an attachment. Now, this attachment that happens at the extremes of all of our ethical relations and prevents us from purification, we can think of it through a metaphor, which is water. So if we put our finger into lukewarm water, we almost have to remind ourselves that there is water there in the first place. Yes, if you move your finger quickly, you'll realize, yes, my finger is in water. If you put your finger into extremely cold or extremely hot water, you're going to get a notification immediately that you've done so. You won't forget that you've done so, right? So this is the way of the dunya. The dunya is composed of financial dealings. It's composed of events that require anger and desire, and it's composed of our engagements with other people's impression of us and the respect that we as human beings, wish to hold in other people's hearts. Okay? These are the goods that the khayrat, that the dunya is composed of. When I'm dealing with one of these, I want to deal with it in a way that expresses detachment from the mulk, from the material, or I don't like the word material world. There is no such thing as a material world, there's a corporeal world. Why? Because everything around us is informed matter. There are intelligible realities in all of the matter that's around us. It's not just matter. Its being comes about because it has intelligible form and shape, and each thing that composes the world is a something. It's not just absolute characterless matter. Okay, but that's a side point. So we live in a corporeal world, but we want to transcend it to a world of the malakut and the meanings. Okay, how do we do this? When we have the engagements of amal and muamala, social, let's say ethical and social interactions, if we hold ourselves to the mean, it becomes as though we are detached, and what happens is that in the practical part of the soul, we have an active disposition towards our lower faculties of anger and desire. We put them in their proper place. We draw on them when we need to. They become part of a unity and a whole which is expressed spiritually in this unity which emerges. Now, when that happens as well, the soul loses its detachment from the corporeal world. It becomes receptive to the incorporeal world. It's only when we are active towards the corporeal world that it ceases to print its forms on our heart. As long as the forms of the corporeal world are imprinted on our heart and we're unable to transcend them and we're attached to them, we get tangled in them, and we cannot be receptive to knowledge, the highest of which is knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the purification that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us and to allow us to engage with the social interactions in a way that help bring that about. That idea of ethics and the unity and purification, that is the solidarity at the individual level. It's the unity at the individual level. Now let's talk about the anti-culture that we inhabit. As I mentioned before, this is something that a sociologist would agree with. Every traditional culture has been a body, sometimes they use technical words like remissions and restrictions. It's a way of regulating the laws and expectations that people carry really kind of in their minds and heart, but which affect the way that we interact with each other. So the culture is this repository which is sort of intangible, but when you sit back and reflect on it, you can describe it very carefully, and then you can type different types of cultures. This culture inclines to this culture inclines to that. Now, something which seems to be universal across pre-modern cultures is that they demanded a self-sacrifice of the individual, which at the same time causes, or potentially causes, a purification. So, if you think of even various movies these days, they deploy the trope or the theme of spiritual development. They deploy the idea that a character has to develop and go through certain stages, they're really internal. Okay, but what a culture will do is it will force you to say, okay, you live in this city-state, for instance. When there is a war, or when there is disagreement, or when there is a famine, or whatever it is, that threatens the community, people have to sacrifice their own individualism and their own idiosyncrasies, their own hang-ups, in order to integrate as a single body in that community. And as I mentioned, Freud, really his role here is just as an assessor. He's saying, I can no longer advise that people do this with the modern culture. Okay, so Philip Rieff has called the contemporary culture that emerged from what has also been called by sociologists the death of God. What can you say other than astaghfirullah? But when a given culture no longer has enough of an agreement that God exists to make him a reference point, then, as you will see, even things like morality will necessarily break down. And things will drift towards nihilism. And in order to fill that gap, the modern state will say, no, we can't have nihilism for whatever reasons. Either because we're attached to our national identity, we're attached to our investments, it's going to lead to disorder. So they construct a moral teaching which is not actually coming out of a belief. And this is ideology. And it will use truisms. It will say things like lying is bad. Okay, well, we already knew that lying was bad. Okay, but a real nihilist will not necessarily adhere to the idea that lying is bad, right? So this is the sort of situation that we're in, and now to integrate with this wider culture, where we have learned, as I'll say presently, to turn in on ourselves as individuals, and not only to stay in our comfort zone, but to turn our little psychological comfort zone into a kingdom where it becomes more and more complicated, more and more factors are considered, right? And we start to self-medicate to make our feelings in a certain way. We watch certain programs because without them we feel depressed, we feel down. You know, we have to get on, I'm not going to name any specific sitcoms, and, you know, get our little buzz, even if it's, you know, just at suhoor time or whatever it is. That's where we should almost assume is the starting point for all of us. Okay, modern music is industrialized culture, which is designed to mood modify. Okay, there's no meaning to it. Even the form of music has lost its meaning, but it creates an ambiance that makes us feel in a certain way and helps us carry on. Okay, so this is something Alistair McIntyre has said, which is that you can identify the social types that are in our current society, which is, for instance, the worker, the manager. The manager has to have a hard nose and keep everybody working at the grindstone so that the owner can implement the 4-hour work week and spend his time on a golf course. Okay, but that manager has to have a tough enough face that you will fear them and fear losing your work and not being able to pay your bills if you don't comply. Now, at some point, you might actually get sick, whether this is physically, in which case you go to the modern hospital, which is an arm of the state as well, or you go to the shrink, you go to the psychologist, and their aim is, how many things can I tell this person to get them back to work? Do I need to give them a pill? It's not only much easier for me, less demand than me actually sitting and listening to them, but it makes money for the pharmaceutical company, which runs the whole, you know, I want to say society, but it's not a society. So these are the roles that we have built around ourselves in what has been called I believe it's Durkheim called it the iron cage of technocracy that we construct around ourselves. So it gives us a certain amount of comfort, and that comfort makes us dependent upon it. We don't want to cook meals from scratch. We want to run over to Tesco's and Sainsbury's and get the prepared meals, or at least prepared salads, or diced garlic, or whatever it is. It's just too tiresome for us now to make things from scratch. So we're dependent, and the whole system sort of ticks over with certain paradigms that are monitored by certain people. But what type of culture and society is that? What freedom does it leave for us? And can we afford to just be passive and sit back? Or do we also need to have solidarity there? Just to throw out an example. Let's say someone said, in my country, wherever it is, if I am passive, the entire economic system will be Amazon warehouses, Amazon delivery systems, and the postman knocking at the door as soon as you walk out of your house. And then you have to chase the package, and anyway, or you get it from the collection point. No used bookstores. For some of us, that's very important. No, no high streets with individual character. A kind of post-Brexit nightmare of Americanized England, and that's what happens if you're passive. Or you could be active. Say, I want a solidarity. I want a unity. What is my notion of the economic, which is healthy? The very least that you could do without being a theorist is make a portal that allows people to buy what they need from individual businesses, from people that are trying to survive outside of a wage labor system, which then becomes contractual, and you can watch all that develop over the decades, right? In other words, corporations used to take care of you. They would think right off the bat about your retirement. You're going to retire with us, you're going to have a career with us. Yes, it was still wage labor, but then Okay, so I think it's important for us to be able to identify, even if we're not academics, etc., what are some of the major turns that took place to make this negative culture, and a sort of psychologized, interiorized culture that also explains a lot of the issues that are extremely pressing for us, which I think you'll see that I'll get to very briefly here. So if we just begin, let's say that you can trace the origins and genealogy of modernity on the theoretical and knowledge or epistemological side, or you can look at the practical and political and social. It's more appropriate for us to talk about the latter today. It's also a little bit simpler. So you could begin with the reforms of 1277, where there is this attack on certain forms of Christian theology that led to the idea that law is externally imposed onto natures, and that it is God who governs through what we can call a divine command virtue system, where things are good because God has told you to do them. They don't have an intrinsic nature. They are rather particles in a set of external imposed laws. So this shift from the idea that the cosmos, and with a cosmology, is a universe of the divine, the angelic, the human, the animal, the mineral, where things have internal natures and causes, is abandoned, and the idea that God is a sort of arbitrary legislator comes in its place. This actually helps the first figure I was going to mention come into being, which is Descartes. So Descartes says, turn inward, and he says knowledge is not through you looking at things and abstracting their nature from them, like what is a bicycle, what is a meteor, what is a car, what is a human, based on your accumulated sense and then memory and experience until you start to conceptualize what they are. No. For him, you go inside from the cogito. I think, therefore I am. You've probably all heard it. This is the beginning of a shift in modernity. And outside of us is just a mechanical world, including animals. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes after, and arguably we're talking about a romantic reaction to certain elements of modernity, but it's still within modernity, feelings are paramount to one's identity, and they determine who we are. Our feelings determine who we are. So Descartes turned us inward. Rousseau makes these feelings crucial for our identity, more so than our family, religion, or our intellect, or other things, our belongings even. It's about our feelings, right? Marx, and this is a set of bullet points, practically, but I think it's good to sort of hear the genealogy and unfolding. Marx rendered everything political, including all social interactions. So for him, there really only is the political and the economic. Everything else is just is a construct produced by that. So you will now notice that, and I've just come back from a 2-week trip to the States, things like Boy Scouts, clubs, the family, roles in the family, everything is now politicized, right? Once someone politicizes that thing, whatever it is it political to shop at Sainsbury's? Is it political to do this? The other person is necessarily drawn into also politicizing it. And so it has a dynamic which takes over and changes all of the fundamentals that we take for granted. In that context, Nietzsche says that morality is a fiction. It's constructed in our past. And then you can see where Freud is able to come in and say that the psychologized self of Rousseau and the Romantics is now given a sexual shape. The feelings fundamental to our identity include our sexual orientation, not only as an act, but as a desire and feelings. This is who I am, this is my identity. And then Wilhelm Reich, who helped with the sexual revolution, little ears, with Reich, the implications that are already there in Freud, etc., are brought out, and if we are fundamentally in our identity, our sexual desires, then how society treats those desires is of the utmost political importance. So this is how things get turned upside down stage by stage. And that political importance becomes the new burning issue and the form of oppression that needs to be faced, right? So while repression used to be financial repression or maybe racial, so in all of this we see the corruption of religion, morality, and politics, and we have to ask the question, how can a culture survive without religion, morality, and a genuine politics? I want to just conclude this with bringing it all back together very briefly, and happy to bring out any further points in the Q&A. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina nabi alayhi salatu wassalam. La ilaha illallah. So we need a culture, but we do not have a culture which contains the solidarity that we need. Now, it's not all about pointing a finger, because this is something that our own homelands have, in very many cases, if we still refer to it as a homeland, which is a personal decision, they have also had a cultural transformation, or they're undergoing it, or the cities have undergone it but the villages haven't, and there's sort of a tension there and a political, an economic inequality where everyone is trying to pour into the cities and find work even if they don't have the skill set to do so. So there are all these transformations that are going on, and very quickly the cultural problems that I mentioned that justify us terming modern cultures an anti-culture, they're pouring into our culture. So the very least that we can do is think collectively, which again is a form of solidarity. As soon as you put heads together, there's a unity, there's a solidarity, and there's also the potentiality of disagreeing. Okay, there's also the potentiality of getting annoyed. There's also the potentiality that someone's elbow is a little too far over and they're crimping your style, or this guy is whatever, he's friends with someone else, or perhaps someone even they curse, or they use foul language, they watch movies or whatever. These are the realities that will inevitably rise up before our eyes. But first of all, if we remember that this is an opportunity for purification, that as soon as we engage with it as amal, as ethical, it's not terribly easy to translate amal just as ethics, right? And to still contain the idea that this is the Islamic notion of how we purify the soul through the character traits. But if we try and imagine that we're dealing with someone, okay, they are going to press our buttons. That means we had a button which we would not have had the opportunity to be pressed. It's like an aspect of our mirror that we can polish when we attempt to work with each other with all the differences that we have, right? So it gives us more of an opportunity to not only oppose the self, but to aim for virtue. It's a fantastic thing and a very transformative aspect of what we call virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is distinct from all other notions of virtues. And, people like to hear this. It's making a very big comeback academically. It's now something that you can refer to at the university. You can use it as a paradigm in schools or whatever. Virtue ethics. What matters is not only the act. I can do an action like donating to the mosque in order that my name is mentioned in front of the microphone and in front of the congregation. Now, that act internally is riya. It is ostentation or showing off, etc. Okay, so if I'm attempting to attain the virtue of generosity and transform my soul, then the action has this ethical and spiritual meaning, which is definitely the ruh of the message that the Prophet ﷺ brought. And we can implement this as we are trying to either repair our culture or to keep it from collapsing. But this requires thinking with each other. What are the institutions that are on the attack? They are definitely marriage, having children, and social interactions which are not purely for business, etc. These are all things that could be spoken about, but I want all of us to raise our own bar to the very highest. The highest of bars in the dunya is the Prophet ﷺ. We are ordered as an ummah to protect this blessing that Allah has given us. The Quran speaks about bunyan marsus. So over and over, the Quran is being recited, and this is the spirit that we need to capture. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us, through the barakah of Ramadan, not only the motivation, but the motivation to continually implement this, to identify the problems that are there, to come up with a collective solution, to implement them, to overcome ourselves and the social issues and barriers that prevent us from losing this blessing, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that as we inevitably go further and further into the end times and to Akhir Zaman, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from fitnat Masih al-Dajjal, from the tribulations of the Dajjal and the culture of the Dajjal, and that as many of us as possible survive from this and preserve the spirit of solidarity, and that we take it as something that we know about, that we are experts about. I don't care if you're an expert in your business, but you don't know how to live as a man or a woman and a Muslim and a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not all about our CVs. Our CVs will be read to us on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the most beautiful of CVs, that in His presence, that we are happy that the Prophet ﷺ smiles when he looks at how we lived in this short blink of a dunya existence. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Ala niyat at-tawfiq. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq and for barakah in this month and in this topic chosen by one of the great awliya. And we ask Allah to accept with the barakah of His beloved Fatiha. Alhamdulillah.